Good evening and thanks for joining us. The Senate spending scandal that has plagued the Conservative government for months turned a serious corner today. Nigel Wright, the Prime Minister's trusted former Chief of Staff, is now an RCMP suspect. He's being investigated for fraud, bribery and breach of trust in that deal to pay off Mike Duffy. And court documents released today raise fresh questions about when the Prime Minister first knew of Nigel Wright's so-called secret deal. Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Jacques Bourbeau begins our coverage tonight.
Senator Mike Duffy was in a jam. He had to pay back $90,000 in housing expenses, and he didn't have the money. So Nigel Wright came forward and gave Duffy the 90 grand, but new court documents filed by the RCMP say this isn't a case of a friend helping a buddy. Instead, the RCMP believes Duffy and Wright may be guilty of bribery. The court documents show Duffy agreed to repay the money, but only if 5 conditions were met. And on February 22nd, Nigel Wright wrote an email saying, "I now have the go-ahead on point 3. And an hour later, another email said, "We are good to go," from the Prime Minister.
We are good to go. Good to go with what?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Good to go with Mr. Duffy repaying his own expenses. As Mr. Speaker, he has acknowledged I told him personally, as he told everybody he had done, including the Canadian public.
Since this scandal erupted, the Prime Minister has been very clear when he first learned of Nigel Wright's secret deal with Mike Duffy.
On Wednesday, May the 15th, I was told about it.
But the day before, May 14th, Nigel Wright wrote that the PM knows in broad terms only that I personally assisted Duffy when I was getting him to agree to repay the expenses.
He keeps avoiding the clear question as to whether or not he knew that Nigel Wright had personally assisted Mike Duffy. Can he tell Canadians what he knew?
Mr. Speaker, it is in black and white that I did not know. The RCMP confirms it.
In a statement, Nigel Wright continues to insist he did nothing wrong. I acted within the scope of my duties, and my actions were lawful. By contrast, the Prime Minister has increasingly said Wright made a big mistake.
Note that it is these 2 individuals and these 2 individuals who are under investigation for what was an improper payment. I think something Mr. Wright himself admits.
The RCMP documents also show the Prime Minister's office did its best to whitewash Duffy's behavior by trying to stop the Deloitte audit into Duffy's expenses. The PMO asked Senator Gerstein to speak to a contact within Deloitte to see if repayment by Senator Duffy would result in the audit being halted. RCMP investigators also don't think much of Mike Duffy's many allegations in this scandal. For example, Duffy says the secret $90,000 deal was a monstrous fraud created by the Prime Minister's office. But as the RCMP investigator dryly notes, it was Duffy himself and his demands for help to pay off his expenses that were the real start of this monstrous fraud. Donna?
Jacques Bourbeau in Ottawa. Thanks, Jacques. Let's go to our chief political correspondent, Tom Clark, now also in Ottawa. Tom, these are allegations of criminal acts committed by one of Stephen Harper's most trusted people. How does this change where the story goes from here?
Well, it's the problem when you open a Pandora's box, Donna. Everything becomes unpredictable after that. But what we do know is that this is going to change the tone of the Senate scandal, because now it is always going to be referred to in a criminal context. Now, let's be clear, these are allegations, not charges, but nevertheless, when words like bribery and breach of trust are thrown around, it becomes a real problem for Stephen Harper. I think that the other thing is that these documents now show us just how deeply involved the PMO was in the Senate scandal right from the beginning, something that we didn't know before. And it also raises, among many other questions, this one. Back on June 5th, Stephen Harper stood in the House of Commons and said nobody in his office knew about the Nigel Wright $90,000 check. We know that's not true. And at that very moment that he said it, a lot of his senior staff knew that it wasn't true. So what happened? Did they go to Stephen Harper and say, "Boss, you got it wrong, you got to correct it," and did he simply ignore them? Or did his senior staff just be silent about it? Either way, it's not a good answer for Stephen Harper.
And Tom, these are, as you point out, allegations at this stage, but charges are possible, which would then lead to a court case and people being called to testify under oath. What's the time frame for all this?
Well, we don't know. We know that the RCMP investigation is continuing. For how much longer, we're not sure. But at least now, Donna, we know what they're thinking and what they're looking for. Now, if there are charges, they still could be months away and a trial much longer than that. But here's what it looks like on the political calendar. These explosive charges coming today come just days before 4 very critical by-elections across Canada. And if there is to be a trial, it could very well not happen until, say, around 2015, which just happens to be the date of the next federal election. There is no good news in any of this for Stephen Harper tonight.
Tom Clark in Ottawa, thank you.
You bet.
And if you care to comb through those RCMP documents for yourself, we've posted them all online at our website, globalnews.ca.